Today was again a lesson about why you don't write a sermon before you go on vacation. Because while you're away on vacation, it's wrestling with it and coming back and saying, I guess that's not going to be the sermon. I didn't even take the sermon with me. So bear with me with the revisions that I believe the Lord had me make for today. So as we heard from the scripture, Jesus had just heard some news. And so you understand the context. The news that he had just heard is that his cousin, John the Baptist, had been beheaded. Now, I want you to think back over the last few chapters that we've looked at. You kind of have a storyline that's been started. He's rejected by his people in his hometown. And then, after John's arrested, many of John's disciples started to question the legitimacy of Jesus. And you have rejection there. So here Jesus is dealing with his cousin, the forerunner, having been killed by Herod, which was a backhanded rejection of Jesus by Herod. One of the things that we often hear, especially when it comes to the miracles, is you really don't believe that, do you? I mean, come on. And this is one particular passage where we get that a lot. Come on, pastor. Come on, student. You really don't believe that 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish fed 5,000 families, do you? Well, the answer is, yeah, I do. It is ironic, though, that this is something that's picked out to be questioned. Think about back to the Exodus. For 40 years, God provided. Let's think about the manna and the significance that manna had. Manna appeared as provision for the Israelites. They couldn't farm because they had not yet received the land that they had been promised. God was teaching them and purifying this people who had just come out of slavery. This is quite a transition. He was readying them for their land. He was readying them for the promise. Until they were ready to set foot into a new season of promise. This time of purification required God to provide for their earthly needs, and in some very unique ways. Exodus 31 talks about during the time the Israelites wandered in the desert, the Lord provided for them through a miraculous food substance that came with the morning dew and looked like frost on the ground. Exodus 16:31 describes it as something like coriander seed, white, and its taste like wafers and honey. The substance was unique in the manner and time span the Lord used it in the lives of the Israelites. But the spiritual concepts involved with the manna still apply to us today. Manna appeared as a provision for the Israelites during a time when they were fully dependent upon God. Not only did God deliver food, what else did God do for them? Any of you remember? Water. But what else? Well, he did provide those, but think back to Deuteronomy 29, and that's not a memory passage of ours, okay? But I've led you 40 years in the wilderness. Your clothes have not worn out on you, and your sandal has not worn out on your foot. You've not eaten bread, nor have you drunk wine or strong drink, in order that you might know that I am the Lord your God. So not only did manna come down to feed them, what they had lasted. Now, I don't know about you, but I know that when my dad died, and it was just me and my mom, and at first she was on Social Security, things lasted. Money stretched. Many times we could never explain how or why, other than it was definitely the hand of the Lord, and we recognized what it was. The question isn't how. The question is why. We don't know how the Lord operates, but he does give us whys. I was hungry and you gave me food. Let me say that again. I was hungry and you gave me food. See, some things are important enough to say them twice. And this is one of those statements. Jesus told us that when we finally are judged, we will hear him speak these words to those who have made feeding the hungry a priority. I was hungry and you gave me to eat. Now, despite food basket programs, and despite the efforts of the government, and despite this commandment of Jesus to feed the hungry, this is still a very hungry world. Most studies on the issues indicate that over 800 million people do not have enough to eat. 800 million. Again, you get into one of those big numbers. What's that mean? I mean, okay, more than the population of the United States, Canada, Europe, and Japan. Think about that. That gives some conceptualization to how many people that is. Those aren't merely social statistics. If they were, it wouldn't be in the sermon. These are people made in the image of God. over 800 million people are hungry. They're the plight of those whom Jesus tells us to feed. And these are the facts on which we'll be judged. They're challenges to the choices we make, both individually, as a church, as a society, and even as a nation. And speaking of choices, let me talk about a choice. I want you to remember back to this event. Do y'all remember back about a little less than 100 years ago, the mass protest that occurred when the government decided to take over the diaconal responsibility of the general public? Do you remember the protests of all the churches storming Washington, saying, "You can't do that. That's our responsibility. We have the responsibility to people in our community. That's how we share the good news. No, you can't do that. You can't take over social welfare." Do you remember those protests? No, because they never happened. The church never protested. As a matter of fact, many probably, I hate to say, rejoiced that they had been relieved of responsibility. But while we've been relieved of responsibility, we did keep our tax-exempt status, which we actually had because of what a service we were to the community. We were still able to eventually write off our donations to a church as it being a charitable organization. But today, when we think about who meets the needs of the poor, who meets the needs of the widow and the orphan, we don't think of the church. We think of the government. That's a choice. And our choice we had was in this story. Now, Matthew's account is written to Hebrews. It's written to people that basically are expected to know the Old Testament prophecies behind it. So there's many things in it that aren't in it, that are in the other Gospels. So let me read from Mark to give us more context. Mark tells us, beginning in chapter 6, verse 30, the apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all they had done and taught. See, they were just coming back from their missionary journey. He said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in a boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. Now as he, Jesus, went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. When it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy something for themselves." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." They said to him, "Are we going to go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." When they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he ordered them to get all the people to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and of 50s. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, and he blessed, and he broke the loaves, and he gave them to his disciples and set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And all ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of fish. Those who had eaten the loaves numbered 5,000 men. John's account adds a name to it, of Philip. And Philip was named because Philip was from there. So if anybody would know where to get food, it would have been Philip who knew where to get it. He knew where the provisions were. But the story isn't about the how. It does point to one boy's choice, though. One boy's choice was when they came around to find out how many loaves he had. I'm surmising this boy had a basket, because it was customary for them at times to take and to put a loaf of bread inside their tunic when they were traveling. But 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish with a young lad wouldn't fit too well under his tunic, especially the 2 fish. He most likely had a basket that he was carrying it in. And he had the faith to give it to the disciples. Now, I just want you to think about how unusual it is for a teenager who came prepared to give up his provisions. Notice it didn't say, "Oh, let me have my meal and I'll give you my leftovers." No. He gave it to them and trusted that he would have enough. Yes, how would we have responded? And let's use some honesty in this. I think in the 21st century version of this, I think we hear the people in the crowd say, "Hey, if they were stupid enough to come out here in the desert with no provisions at night with no food, and come on, get real. I brought my food along. If I could think about it, what's their problems?" We might even, and now I know it won't be anybody in this room, We might even say, moron. What are you thinking? Now, we don't question God feeding millions of people. I think the count is somewhere around 2 million in the Exodus for 40 years. But Jesus, we question and say you can't believe that when he feeds 5,000 families at a sitting. Again, it's not the how, it's the why. And the why behind this is, despite Jesus just finding out about his cousin being beheaded, despite his disciples being worn out from their missionary journey and just meeting back with Jesus and just being told that they were going to go take a retreat, but the people could see them and beat them to where they were going. And Jesus had compassion on them. I'm not a Greek expert, but I'm told that particular word has something to do also with a feeling in the gut of compassion, like a burning compassion. His needs were secondary to theirs, and he saw them as a people in need of a shepherd. He sent his disciples out. And he told them, you feed them. Now think about, here we have a desert. And think back a little bit, okay? A desert and bread. Oh, that's right. Jesus was tempted to feed himself by the devil when he was starved. But here, in this story, we're being told about Jesus having compassion on people. And not only did he have compassion for their spiritual state, Jesus realized these are whole people. What did he do when he got off the boat? He ministered to them and he healed their sick. He met their physical needs. He sat them down and he fed them. He met their physical needs as well as their spiritual needs because he had compassion on them. On Jesus' list of priorities, he's made it clear, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. The moral value to which Jesus gave the most weight, and I would say the spiritual value of it too, was caring for the poor. The value of caring for those who have less. And I don't care how you study this and how you search it. There's no way around this. That's the core of this. The young man in the gospel today could not run from the choice. He either had to say yes or he had to say no. And in many ways, you and I are in the same place. We have a lunch basket. We're surrounded by a hungry crowd. And we have to respond. Yes or no. Now, on a personal level, that challenge comes in a number of ways. Now, at this time of the year, there's no holiday food drives begging for us to participate. In fact, I would imagine the hungry are a bit hungrier in July than they are in November and December, especially around Thanksgiving time. Matter of fact, I've often wondered how people make it the whole way to Thanksgiving without starving to death. Then again, as we heard earlier today, well, maybe they don't. We just don't hear about it. Jesus never implied that he was only talking about our responsibility being around the holiday seasons. And if feeding the hungry is a priority, that we should even be waiting to be asked or reminded. Now, I get that not every single organization can meet every single need in the community, okay? But there are many reputable agencies where either canned goods can be brought to a shelter. And I don't believe we have a soup kitchen in this area. But in places where they have a soup kitchen or food giveaways, that we can help in distributing food. We can write a check, because there's groups out of Greater Pittsburgh Food Bank, the service all the way up here to northern Cambria. But the call of Jesus included a commandment that appears to go beyond the personal. We're all part of a church, and we're all part of a nation. And the policies of our churches and the policies of our nation must be a concern. Now, going back 100 years, you and I can probably had a good discussion whether the primary responsibility of the government is to feed people, or if that was the primary responsibility of the church. But being 100 years removed from it, and after we lost that giant protest, the one that we didn't have, and the one that we haven't had since, demanding that back, because in my book, the people of God would be much more responsible in feeding the community than the government would ever be. We could feed many more people with less dollars and help more people, because today the help comes without any responsibility, without any call to change a lifestyle. We used to take a look at people's income and expenses and have to make a decision of why they were having financial problems. Sometimes it was just a life event that occurred and it was going to go away, and they just needed help through. Other times, maybe they became disabled and were unable to work. But oftentimes, two other things showed up. Either substance abuse or gambling, which I'll consider as one, vices. Or just plain inability to budget your money. And when we diaconally counseled the people, we met their needs first. And then we counseled them. Why? Because we had the door open then. And we were able to do it. And we were the source of moral authority. We were there to help. We were there because we cared. And we were there to help them get back on their feet again. The concept of teaching them to fish as opposed to just giving a fish for a day. But since we are not there, and most likely, I don't believe it's going to be in the foreseeable future that the church is going to be grabbing that responsibility back. In the meantime, I believe it is our responsibility to make our voice known that we expect the money that we give that's earmarked for people to be fed, be used responsibly. And to make our voice known, because it is your dollars going to it. And calling for responsible use of money. When we're held to account that they're fed, we're only left a couple of choices. Either take the responsibility ourselves or hold the other to account, or to do both. The hungry among us today are not as obvious as they were in Jesus' time. I was just in Greeley, Colorado. When I lived there 17 years ago, the town was slightly under 50,000 people. Today, I return at over 150,000. Construction just everywhere. I think they're building houses as fast as they can, and they're filling them that quick. But one thing I did see when we went in town and went into the Sam's and Walmart, in front of the Eaton Park there that sits in that corner underneath the trees were the homeless. And they rotated, holding the signs on the street. The hungry are there. It's easy to sit back and let our leaders make decisions that address the command of Jesus to feed the hungry. But the numbers are not lying, at least not in this case. Often, our leaders need to be led. Need to be led by the people of God and need to be prayed for by them, by us. The faith of the young boy in the gospel cannot feed our world today. Just simply can't do it. But our faith can. So is our faith that God can and will work miracles with our generosity strong enough that we will say yes and even go beyond that. Do we believe Jesus fed the 5,000? I do. I believe you do. but how it relates to us today. Do you believe Jesus still feeds the 5,000? Do you still believe that God is our Jehovah Jireh, our provider, and that his kingdom has been established? And his kingdom is here to still bring the message to the people, just like Jesus and his disciples did. We are to feed the poor. We are to see that it's done. Do we believe that our efforts will change things? Or do we believe that God's calling us to make an effort and that he will bring the change by honoring our collective efforts? That's what I believe. Matthew's version of feeding the 5,000 didn't identify the owner of the loaves and the fish. But John's did. They say that during that time, many people who went to the events like that, under their tunics, would keep a couple of loaves of bread. The how is not important. But all I know is that when Jesus' disciples went around and asked who had food, the only person that responded yes was the boy who had the basket of food. Sometimes it takes one. Sometimes it takes one person, generosity, to spark others' generosity. The problem of feeding the world and feeding the hungry is beyond us individually. But as the people of God collectively, it's not. All it takes is our belief that God will honor his word if we do our part. Will you? Let's pray. Almighty God, we thank you that this miracle of 5,000 families being fed was not a one-time event. And that while it occurred, it's included in all four Gospels because of how powerful it is. And what our responsibility is to those around us. We are to share the life of the kingdom and meet others' needs. Lord, touch us, minister to us. Show us how in our world we can do what you are calling us to do. And we ask it in your name. Amen.